Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith.
Welcome to Veritas et Fus, or Truth and Incense, a podcast covering the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the faith, and the liturgy, which is the public expression of that faith, especially as seen through the Anglican heritage. We're your hosts. I'm Father Gregory Seeley, priest in charge in St. Thomas of Canterbury in Roanoke, Virginia, and
I'm Father Deacon Lance Davis. I'm curate at All Saints Church in Aiken, South Carolina.
So I want to revisit something we've kind of touched before previously, but I want to do what in modern parlance is called a deep dive. And I want to talk about prayer and the nature of prayer, because I think Anglican prayer, the Anglican Church, has something about it in its philosophy of prayer that is really important and has been sometimes is lost in other areas, and I think it's unfortunate. Really, there are three kinds of prayer. There is small prayers said, Jesus, Son of God, have mercy. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, or Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I love you, save souls, or something of that nature, referred to as an ejaculatory prayer, not the best term for it. Very small prayers can be said randomly. Then you have more organized prayer, like the Rosary, which are meditations, and there are prayers to go along with them, Our Fathers and Hail Marys, and meditations surrounding them. You have an even more intense version of that, and say the Ignatius exercises of Saint Ignatius, which are designed to put you into the mysteries of God and to help you to meditate. And the last one is the monastic one, and that is in fact, I'm going to introduce this now, Father Deacon. I was going to do it later, but and that is the idea of praying through the scriptures, and that praying the old monastic method, which has a threefold process, which is lectio, or a reading, meditatio, or meditation, and contemplatio, or contemplation, reading of the texts, considering the texts both with your own natural intellect and through prayer, and then the light that God gives you, that God touches your heart, or the place where you and God meet with this text, with the Psalms, with the scriptures, which doesn't necessarily need to be done. You need to pull yourself away to do this. It's something that monks did for many centuries, and the Roman Catholics were especially fond of the Rosary. And we both spent time with Roman Catholicism, and that's one thing that I found dissatisfying about Roman Catholic prayer relatively early on, was that the church as a whole does not pray together. You have the priests and the religious who say their breviaries. The Mass, they come together. The Mass is mostly silent. It is a sacrifice offered by a priest, and you unite your heart to it. And then the faithful have their rosary to the side, and there are some devotionals you can do as a church. But the church as a whole does not pray together. And this is different in Anglicanism, and the ethos and the philosophy of prayer in Anglicanism was very different. And Father Deacon, would you go into, you were talking to me before about, and we've talked about some before, but the kind of the prayer book Life is Rule and the philosophy of, say, Northern Catholicism.
Yeah, so I think we have to understand that what we're dealing with when we talk about an Anglican approach to prayer, or an English Catholic approach to prayer, versus, say, maybe a more modern post-Reformation Protestant approach or counter-Reformation Roman approach, is really a question of temperament. And a term that's been used to describe this in the English context is Northern Catholicism. It's actually the title of a book in the 30s that was discussing the goals and effects of the Oxford movement and such in England in the 19th century. And what I think we can see is that there has been a development over the course of the history of the faith in the British Isles that has led to a particular temperament, not just amongst the peoples of those isles, but also amongst the way that religion has been practiced within the church. And there are three main streams, I would say, that converge to create this ethos, this temperament. The first would be ancient Celtic monasticism. This idea that we know in the early sort of Anglo-Saxon period of the church, the monastic foundations in those lands were interesting because, first of all, they tended to be mixed houses. But they were houses that did not take vows the way we think of them today in terms of the vows of poverty, celibacy, these sorts of things, but rather it was one large community of persons, usually a village or something like that, centered around the parish with the clergy. So you had families, you had those who had taken vows of celibacy. But it was a complete group of people, all with their own vocations within the community, that lived an intentional life of prayer, centered around the sacraments of the church and the work necessary in the community. Now, of course, then over time, we get this Benedictine rule that develops on the continent, and then spreads into England centuries later, and really the Benedictine houses became hugely influential in England. And the development from the earlier Anglo-Saxon Celtic model, we still see something interesting develop in England that was fairly unique compared to the rest of the continent. And that was the Benedictine houses became themselves the center of the broader communities. In fact, most of the cathedrals in England in the pre-Reformation era were Benedictine houses. That was not normative throughout the rest of Europe. And so the monastic approach, particularly the Benedictine approach, to prayer as work and work as prayer, ora et labora, had a massive influence on the spirituality of the English people. So, for example, you see after we have literacy begin to increase, sort of in the late Middle Ages, you see a great devotion to primers in the English church, praying of the little office of Our Lady, the bidding of the beads, as we refer to it now, our very word bead for, say, a rosary, referring to the offering of prayers. There was a sense that the people in England very much were in tune with the cycle of prayer of the monastics. We know that offices of matins and evensong in the pre-Reformation time were quite popular with the people in England, and there was frequent attendance at those liturgies. And so even if the people might not be necessarily joining in with all of the Latin or the full round of the prayers as the monks had them, there was a strong sense of union with them, and that the community revolved around this. And then at the Reformation, we have this third stream that produces itself with the prayer book. And there's been much made of what might be called the Benedictine spirit of the prayer book. And I think that it's very clear that there adheres within the model of religious life presented in the prayer book the idea that the public cycle of prayer is something that should prevail with the clergy and with the people. So, for example, we have the offices of daily morning and evening prayer. The early prayer books make it very clear that the clergy are required to pray those, continuing the older Catholic approach to the daily offices as being part and parcel to the clerical life. But what's interesting is right there in those first editions of the prayer book, you have this little rubric that says that the clergy are to toll the bell when they go to the church. And by the way, they are supposed to pray those offices in the church proper. And they toll the bell to let the people know that now they will be offering morning and evening prayer, and to summon as many of the people as possible to join them. Of course, the liturgy is also put into the vernacular, and so the ability is presented in a more direct way for the people to participate, not just by their presence or by the visual experience of the liturgy, but also now with the words themselves and the texts of the offices. And it's very clear that Cranmer has a sense that there is certainly a weekly, if not a daily round of services publicly, where you have this idea of the Eucharist being at the very center. You have the daily offices, morning and evening prayer, surrounding that. And then you have devotional services that he puts on a particular schedule. So something like the litany. And the litany is pretty clearly envisioned to be done every Sunday at bare minimum. Also Wednesdays and Fridays.
I find that fascinating. I was reading something recently where the litany was actually the first of the prayers to be translated into English.
Right.
And the reasoning behind it was argued that before that, when something was to be prayed for, it was the domain of the monks or the canons or the clergy, and they would pray for you. And the church said, no, people should pray on their own for their needs. And so they did. They translated the litany into English, and then you'd have, and it was from, and I think it was Jeremiah, it was one of the prophets, the priest between the vestibule and the altar will, have mercy on thy people, O Lord, let them not be overtaken by their enemies. But the idea of the priests leading the people in prayer for their needs became a very important. It was kind of the gateway drug of this idea of the clergy leading the people in public prayer.
That's right. Of course, the idea, the litany desk itself, as it came to be practiced in England, being situated right there, essentially at the crossing, so that the priest was half in the nave and half in the sanctuary. And what's interesting is, I feel very strongly that Cranmer's sentiments that went into the crafting of the prayer book are not in any way, shape, or form unique to him. I think what he's doing is taking the very best of medieval spirituality, particularly in England, where there was, by and large, a strong sense of the interconnectedness of the laity with the clergy. I mean, you think again about the sort of the ceremonial. It was wonderfully elaborate and mellifluous. There was clearly a strong sense that even if the texts themselves may have been in a language that in its entirety most of the people couldn't understand, it's very clear from the ceremonial that people knew what was going on. It was designed to be really beautiful, and we think about how in the great cathedral cities, it was generally the custom that on Sundays and major feasts, all of the clergy in the city came together with the bishop for the principal mass on the Sunday. So you had these great processions of dozens of clergy going through the church, and all the altars being censed, and the people gathering together. I mean, really, you get here a hearkening back to the very earliest days of the church. Everyone gathered together around the bishop, as we see in the Didache, for example. So I think what Cranmer's doing is he's recognizing the beauty of all of that, simplifying it obviously to a certain extent, trying to find a way to bring the people further into it as a textual experience, not just an experiential one. But then what's interesting to me is that what winds up happening in the post-Reformation world on the continent it really is quite divergent from what Cranmer establishes in England. So, for example, in both continental Protestantism and in the counter-Reformation Roman Church, you really have this embrace of individualism in the spiritual life. And it takes two different approaches. Okay, so on the one hand, the Protestants clearly, they developed this idea of the personal confession of faith, justification by faith alone, and this sense that it's really about me. Jesus came to save me. Of course, there's truth to that, but my salvation is no longer dependent in any way, shape, or form upon the larger body, because the larger body can clearly err. And so it's up to me to discern when the larger church might be in error and to maintain that faith steadfast on my own, putting the Bible into the hands of the people in this radical kind of way. But Rome, in some sense, does the same thing, just in a different way. So with the codification and simplification of the Mass that took place with Trent and with Pius V, you began to develop what later came to be known as the low Mass culture. You have the growth of the missionary societies, the Jesuits, and things like this. And so as the Roman Church begins to expand, by and large, the form of the liturgy is expanding into these new territories is the simplified low Mass ceremonial of the Tridentine Missal. And so the great grandeur and beauty of the ceremonial of the Middle Ages ceases to be the defining standard in many places. And then the offices themselves also increasingly, again with the Franciscans and the Jesuits primarily, become less of a choral service as they had been. And there was an expectation that they were choral offices for the clergy in the Middle Ages. They increasingly become the private breviary that is prayed alone or maybe in a small group by the clergy on behalf of the rest of the Catholic populace. And so again, the people begin to lose in many places even the opportunity to attend the offices publicly. And so the individualism of something like the Rosary begins to take the foremost place in the spiritual life. So what I think we can really say is that the English Church is trying to maintain an ideal of the communal aspect of the faith, that everyone in his or her vocation as a Christian is called to a life of corporate prayer with the whole body. The continental churches, Roman and Protestant, increasingly develop this individualistic approach. And so by the time you get to, say, the Second Vatican Council, what do you have? I mean, your two most popular devotions in Rome, arguably, would be the Rosary and Benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. And these are both paraliturgical devotions that are related to the official liturgy, but they're not dependent upon it. And so how do we...
I'm sorry, I was just commenting on that. I think that's a really important point, is that one of the things that you almost have, and I don't know this for a fact at all, but it's interesting, catechisms became more and more prevalent in the church, teach people the faith. And I have to wonder if that wasn't partly because of the fact that the faithful weren't involved in the prayer of the church anymore. They weren't reciting the formulas of the church. They weren't, you have, and I find that constantly. It's so easy to preach when you bring up a point of theology or a point of the doctrine of the church, where it is in the liturgy. They hear it every Sunday. And you can show them how this liturgy is teaching them that the public prayer of the church, not only are they praying to God, not only are they offering up worship to God, but they're also learning the faith. There's also an element of theological study and investigation that goes on while the church is praying. It's infused with the doctrine. It's infused with understanding of how God interacts with man and the attitudes toward God and such. And it's infused with with the teachings of the church. And it's something you really see that, I think, post Tridentine Catholicism, and then as you get to the modern era, you have these individual devotions the faithful use to get close to God, to take time out of their day to remember God and to pray and to meditate and things like that. But it isn't catechetical way, and you end up with these separate catechisms that people can teach and learn the faith. Whereas because they're not part of the public prayer of the church, which has this didactic element kind of woven into it.
Right. I mean, there's a very clear sense after the Reformation in most of Protestantism and in the Roman Church, I think, that the faith is intellectualized in the sense that it becomes more about the confession proper being the means to the faith than the lived worship of the church being the means towards engendering faith. And so, for example, with the catechism, what I find interesting is in the prayer book catechism that exists, there's this little rubric at the bottom of it that says, the minister of every parish shall diligently, upon Sundays and holy days, or on some other convenient occasion, openly in the church, instruct or examine so many children of his parish with this catechism. There's a liturgizing of the catechism according to the prayer book rule. And this, again, is what I think is so interesting and unique about the English approach to spirituality, is that it is designed, when done well, to be something that happens in the church with everybody, clergy and people together. We don't really have a strong sense of there's a domestic spirituality that is in some sense different or distinct from what happens at the parish. And Martin Thornton elaborates on this so well, and he really demonstrates in his book English Spirituality that this goes back a long time in the English church, long before the Reformation, that there's this sort of threefold regula rule of life that the prayer book gives us. You know, the Mass or Holy Communion as the encounter par excellence with our Lord in worship is the center of everything. But set around that are the offices, not just daily morning, evening prayer, but all the occasional offices and such as well. And then the devotional offices. All of these things together must be intertwined. And so they have the effect then of an organic unity in the church. But what do you see by and large after the Reformation on the continent? I think you see a very inorganic unity. You have unities imposed by catechisms, by declarations of doctrine, and not that the church hadn't done this before, but I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of your average Catholics would not have been aware of the specifics of the Second Council of Nicaea, for example. Their experience of that council was in its effects on what? On the worship, okay, and the icons, etc. So I think the continental churches lost a very key aspect of this when they essentially distanced doctrine and the appropriation and learning of doctrine from the liturgy. As you brought up the idea of, well, you go to Mass and unite yourself spiritually with it, and that's fine, but it is fundamentally other. And it's even worse by the fact that you had, really up until Pius X, the common practice, at least with Rome, was you did not receive communion with hardly any regularity. So really and truly, the Mass was totally other. It was something else that the priests did. It was their offering entirely on your behalf.
That's, I think, is where I think really the genius of English spirituality comes into it, is And I would almost hold Rome at fault for this in some ways. I think it is um, it's a shift, and I don't know when it began. I've been thinking about this a lot. Actually, is going from the understanding we talked about this last time, where the end of the Eucharist really is the remission of sin. The Eucharist itself was an offering, but it was an offering of Jesus to the Father. It was a perfect offering which brought remission of sin. It was not the expiatory or propitiatory sacrifices of the Old Testament, which pleased God for the remission of sin, for sins committed. That became the carrying of the cross. It became the suffering of the individual Christian offered themselves up in this. And one of the things that you have is the idea of the body of Christ and the idea of praying for and offering up sacrifices certainly continues on in Roman Catholicism and in Anglicanism. I don't know about the Orthodox, but it becomes a much more a private thing. And I think really that the idea of coming together as a community to worship like that. You mentioned earlier about how increasingly you would have, the we would talk about the clergy doing one thing and the laity doing another. And I think the idea of putting these tools, the way the English did, back into the hands of the laity, also made it such that there, I think, there's an access to spirituality which many of your devotions don't have. And I go back and I've heard this any number of times. I remember one time, the question of confession, which is a little bit off subject, but I remember a priest talking about hearing people's confessions, and they could tell who it was in the confessional, and the confession would confess something, and they would recognize them week after week that they weren't making progress, and you would begin to get after them and almost threaten them with holding absolution if they didn't begin making progress against their central vice. And that struck me as a misunderstanding of the nature of carrying the cross, a misunderstanding of the idea that God isn't necessarily going to take your major faults away, because if he did, you wouldn't have anything to offer. The very nature of struggling under your cross, the very nature of having these weaknesses. St. Paul goes on and on about this, and how it isn't him, it's sin. It's the second law of his members. It's sin within him, and this the fact of carrying the cross is what you're offering to God and how you please God. And the idea of access, again, going to the scriptures, the Psalms and the readings from the scriptures, and the considering of these things, and then the praying to God and getting light on these things is, I really think, the best way of coming to a better understanding of the faith and deepening your faith, rather than the formulaic structures were put in place. Obviously, so they began the Middle Ages with people who didn't have access to and wanted to unite themselves with the structure of the monastics. But once it became something that the laity could take advantage of, I think you see, because I remember reading about like the late 15 and 1600s and how you had people who would become very dedicated to morning and evening prayer, become very dedicated to these services, and you'd have people would there actually whole works written like the Complete Angler, which sew in the spirituality of the prayer book, of the scriptures, into daily life in what was the 16th century England. You can really see the effects of this contemplative spirit on the culture as it develops.
That's right. And of course, one of the things that we have to keep in mind that I think is often neglected, in our circles at least, is that the fathers of the Oxford movement were attempting to recover the spirit of the prayer book and the spirit of the prayer book cycle the rule of life. One of the things that really deeply irks me, and this tends to be the case in one particular Protestant denomination that I won't mention, but the use of the term Anglo-Catholic to mean ritualist. Oh, I like incense. I like lace. I like a fiddleback chasuble. So I'm an Anglo-Catholic. No, you're not. No, you're not. That's not what the faith is about. Anglo-Catholicism is essentially concerned with saying, how do we appropriate the Catholic faith within the context of the English Church in its fullness? And we cannot ignore the fact that the prayer book is part and parcel of what it means to be an English Catholic. Now, I tend to take the point of view that when we come to the prayer book, we need to accept it as a given. And I think we should be grateful for the prayer book tradition. It equally disturbs me that there are, it's oftentimes clergy, I think, who have this problem, that would like to just get rid of the prayer book altogether and say, well, we don't need it in any way, shape, or form. Well, I think that's entirely disingenuous to what Anglicanism is. Anglicanism is a practice of Catholicism that has been filtered now for the last 500 years through the spirit given in the Book of Common Prayer. So what we have to acknowledge, I think, is that the rule of life the prayer book gives us is a Catholic rule of life. Now, if we say, well, maybe some of the rituals in the prayer book could be beefed up. Maybe they're not quite as strong as they should be in their texts, in terms of presenting Catholic doctrine. Fine. Then, and Anglican Catholics have been doing this from the beginning of supplementing those with texts or ceremonies that bring out the fuller Catholic truth. So you think of the missals, for example. And again, what's the point of that? To bring a fuller sense of prayer, of the universal Catholic understanding of prayer and the spiritual life to play with the prayer book. But the idea of abandoning it on the one hand, or replacing it with just sort of an empty ritualism on the other, not caring about doctrine and teaching at all, either of those are going to wind up in spiritual failure for the people.
That's fascinating. And it goes back to, I think, what you said in one of previous podcasts was that to say that is to historically misunderstand the nature of the prayer book, because the prayer book wasn't necessarily replacing whole, in any kind of, I'll say, whole cloth manner, the structure of prayer in the church at that time. What it was doing was translating and making more accessible the prayers and the ceremonies. But if the prayer book doesn't tell you to do something, doesn't have direct instructions for you, then you fall back on what the church has always done.
That's right.
You fall back on the rituals that were already in place before the arrival of the prayer book. It's actually, I remember my professor in seminary talking about this, and it's something that is unfortunate because there's a number of things, anywhere from 39 articles, which are kind of a political statement, somewhat bombastic and don't explain themselves, up to the prayer book, which lacks a lot of instruction, and people sit there and scratch their heads and wonder why. And the answer is that it didn't presume to reinvent the wheel. It was simply making that wheel more efficient, and so it brought in and introduced ceremonies where it sought to make the liturgy more accessible and something that would be more usable. But if there were no instructions in place, it was presumed that you would fall back on what the church had been doing. And so it really wasn't inventing anything new. And if you say, oh, I want to go back to when they used incense, they never stopped using incense. I've had people get after me sometimes about whether or not incense is Anglican. And I look at them and I say, you do realize that there's something called a Queen Anne, which is a way of swinging the incense. It's actually named after an English queen who's alive in the 1700s. So don't talk to me about how Anglicanism didn't use incense. The idea is that all these practices of deacons and subdeacons, of the way that the ceremonies were run, like unto the way that Western Church had always done them, were still in place this whole way along. The prayer book in no way sought to supplant that. Where there were instructions, they were designed to make the ceremony more accessible, more didactic, and more accessible. Where there were no instructions, it was presumed that you would continue as the church had previously done.
That's right. I mean, the prayer book in its best is a distillation of the Catholic faith as the English Church had received it, taking into consideration at that time, particularly in the 16th century, errors or confusions that had perhaps come into some of the popular conception of that faith, and an attempt to explicate through liturgical texts, some that were sometimes reworded or even newly composed ones into the vernacular, what that faith actually is to the people. But the error we wind up with today is, on the one hand, you get these Protestants who want to call themselves Anglicans, and they see the prayer book as an exclusivist text. If it doesn't make provision for it, it's not Anglican. Well, for example, the prayer book does not make provision in any of its classical forms for the ablutions of the sacred vessels. Are you to tell me that they didn't happen? No, of course not. Everyone already knew how to do the ablutions, and there was no missal at that point in time in print anywhere that gave directions for that. You had separate books of rubrics. You fall back on what you already knew, unless the prayer book made a specific change to it. But on the other hand, you get people who, last century would have been referred to as Anglo-Papalists, which of course is totally nonsensical as a position now, if it ever was sensible, that say, well, the prayer book, because it finds its genus in the 16th century, therefore must be rejected on the grounds that it came out of the Reformation period, and therefore must be Protestant, whatever that means. So I want to say both of those approaches are incorrect. They miss the point of the prayer book. The prayer book is what it says, is a book of common prayer. It is a rule of life for the common church. It is not an exclusive approach to what prayer is, as if you can't have a liturgy or devotion that's not in the prayer book. But it is a means of regulating what should be the common rule of life for all the people in the realm. And it remains to this day that the English church is the only church in history to have produced such a thing, if you don't count religious orders. Orthodoxy does not have this on a broad scale, and Rome doesn't. And it's fascinating to me that even though both of those confessions have cannibalized parts of the prayer book, neither have really made any progress towards actually produce something that is fully akin to what the Book of Common Prayer is supposed to be. And I think that if we were to abandon the prayer book as a system for a rule of life, then we will lose much of what gives a strong foundation to traditional Anglicanism, and we run the risk of going back into this individualist mentality or clericalist mentality. I mean, look at what's happened in Rome after the council. And I think really what you see is that whole liturgical movement leading up to the Second Vatican Council was an attempt to correct the hyper-clericalist approach to the Mass on the one hand, and the hyper-individualist approach to the spiritual life amongst the laity on the other. And there's lots of excellent work that was being done to bring those two things together without abandoning the ancient tradition. But then after the council, I think what you see is swaying into the total opposite direction. The individualism, in a real sense, becomes canonized. So look at, for example, the immense amount of options that are available in the Novus Ordo Missae, and concurrently in the, say, 1979 prayer book of the Episcopal Church. The modern liturgies are obsessed with this, with optionitis. And why? Because now the liturgy should be a reflection of the community. It's not that the community enters into a communal prayer that forms them together with the clergy, as the prayer book tradition is intended to be, but now rather the liturgy must conform to the sensibilities of that community. And unfortunately, we deal with this in our own parishes because we have oftentimes so many people now who are converts from these other groups that have been formed for 60 years now, and this idea that the liturgy is really about me, what I'm comfortable with. You see the whole thing with incense. I mean, this is always a big thing. And it's funny to me that there's this mentality that the liturgy should reflect my own ideas of spirituality. No, the liturgy is there as a safeguard for the clergy and for the laity. It is the common ground whereby both enter into the prayer of the church. It should be the domain of neither of them exclusively. The clergy have no more right to manipulate the liturgy than the laity do. And we have totally lost this understanding that it's about entering into the prayer life of the Church Catholic.
Exactly.
That's what it's
It is that liturgy, the prayer book liturgy, which is a translation again of more ancient liturgies, as well as the rubrics associated with it, and all the externals, are the product of centuries of the church praying and the church combating its enemies. And you can see it in the various editions of the language, the various editions of things that you do in the rubrics, centuries and centuries of the church praying, struggling, dealing with the problems that came up in it. There's both history and theology there. And you're right, to start changing it to make it fit something, you've lost. It's kind of like taking a World War II memorial and all of a sudden let's move things around to make it more. It's like, well, no. The point is that it looks the way it did because it represents something that happened, and the people who fell, we're remembering those who did it. And there are, when you go into the history of the saints, you can oftentimes find someone who was involved in a controversy which left us Athanasius, the Athanasian Creed. He didn't necessarily write that. It's actually a Spanish thing. It's more of a Western thing, and was done because Arianism continued, and finally the West took it on and such. But still, here is a bishop of the church who went to battle against a heresy, and the Mass actually reflects his battle and the victory thereafter. And you have this in any number of areas in our liturgy, the history of the church, the history of its struggles with whoever it may be. And as you study this, and as you say, if you can, I was thinking about this recently. A head of a religious house that I know was really struggling with the house. And when I was staying there, and this is a little bit of a story, so bear with me. I'd stayed there for a while, and I knew him, and he had actually never been a novice in a monastery. He'd made many retreats and felt that was his vocation, but there really wasn't the house he was looking for. So his bishop gave him permission to start his own house, and it's there and it flounders. But one of the things he didn't have was he never became a novice. And one of the things, and this goes back to your idea of, do you know how to clean the chalice? Of course you do. You were formed. And when a novice enters a monastery, there's a period of the novitiate, the novice master. And one of the things that is, the key and central dynamic of being a novice is to be confronted with a new world that you're unfamiliar with, and the humiliations and frustrations that go with you giving up what you understand, stopping to pray the way that you normally pray, and learning this new life and this new way of living in the church. and there is the office that you have to get used to, and you've got to deal with what page and where the psalms are, and of course there's the singing and the metron, and you're not expected to lead it right away, but it's hard enough to follow when you get started. Follow up with your duties around the monastery and everything, and then of course the meditations and such that you're given to during the day. And it's kind of overwhelming, but 6 months, 8 months in of patience and humility, you get the hang of it. And all it's kind of like a soldier being formed at a boot camp. Next thing you know how to march, you know how to run, you know how to do these things. It's very much it's the church militant. And this is something that the prayer book actually brings down to the laity. If you can humble yourself and you can come in, you can learn morning and evening prayer, and you can learn the Eucharist and such, and you can follow along. You're going to be frustrated in the beginning, and you're maybe be a little bit humiliated in the beginning, not fully understanding. But if you can put the patience in, if you can submit yourself to the mind of the church, and you can learn, you will gain these tools to allow you to truly run the race in the spiritual life, with the sails of the church moving you along. And I'm mixing metaphors here, but the idea being is that it is not a matter of you finding time throughout your day to go and pray your rosary. I've always said that if you have to go out of your way to pray, you will pray less and less because it's not in your way. To stop your day, go off and say your prayers. If you can pray as part of your daily work, then you will pray much more easily and much more regularly. And this is something that the Anglican philosophy of prayer, taking this out, the monks would do this. They would go into the choir, they would sing the psalms, there were readings that they would hear, and then they would go to work. And they would go along and they were praying while they were working. They were meditating over what they heard. They were thinking about it. Obviously, lectio, there was a reading, you listened to the reading. There were also commentaries that you could look at if you didn't really understand what it was about. And then as you went to work, you thought over these things and you just meditated. The mind wandered over these things again. That's fast. I wonder why that is. And that was mixed with prayer. Oh Lord, why did this happen? What's this story about? And God would come, and lights were given, and you were able to enter deeply into these mysteries of the history of sin, of salvation, of expiation, of the glory of God, of what the awe, the fear of the Lord, all of these things to get deeper meanings out of the faith through these tools. And again, monks weren't all geniuses. They were simply men who dedicated themselves to God. People who weren't able to live in monasteries have been left out of this for some time. And this Anglican ethos, this Anglican philosophy of prayer, of taking these religious offices, the structure which had been so well organized, that and taking it and breaking it down to morning and evening prayer for the whole church, and then these smaller offices, if you have time, as just going back and touching base on that, allows you to use these tools that novices in monasteries would use. If you can take the time to discipline yourself and learn how to, in the morning, take your time and say your prayers. Throughout the day, you can go back to the information, you can go back to thinking about meditating on what you've read, and praying. Okay, what does all this mean? And again, you don't need to take time out of work to do any of this. It can just be done momentarily in between whatever, while you're working, especially if the work doesn't require a great deal of concentration. Go back over what you were just reading and think about it, meditate on it, and contemplation will come slowly but surely. If you desire God to speak to you, He will. And I think this really is the just genius of Anglican prayer, of taking these tools which had been honed over centuries and centuries of men whose lives were dedicated to prayer in the heart of the church, and bringing the faithful in and making these tools available to them is such a treasure of prayer that is oftentimes unappreciated.
That's right, and I think unappreciated largely because unknown. In the last 150 years, we've successfully restored the Mass as our central act of worship, and that's a good thing. But what has tended to happen as a result of that? The other offices have fallen away, and so what if someone were to say, well, what is your idea of a really healthy liturgical life in a parish. Yeah, daily mass, that's ideal, but that's just where you start. I mean, ideally, if we're following the prayer book, we have morning and evening prayer being prayed in the church regularly. The litany should be offered on Fridays and Sundays. When was the last time any of our parishes publicly offered one of the offices of instruction in the 1928 prayer book? Now, I know that by and large, our lay people get a lot of conflicting information coming at them from their surrounding culture, both secular and Christian. And our very basic tools were given that, take 5 minutes to do to remind them of the essentials of the faith are just left by the wayside. We don't do it as if we expect that the people are going to go out and learn on their own. I mean, that's a great expectation, but you and I both know historically that just doesn't happen. People have lives and families and responsibilities and duties. And so our issue has been, we have all of these tools, as you put it, to form a robust life of prayer that is both communal and then spills over into the home. And we have been largely content to ignore most of the tools. And I think if we really want to see a renewal within Catholic Anglicanism, we have to restore the tools, all of them. One of the nice things about our jurisdiction is that the canons really give us access to the best of our tradition to be used liturgically. We have a lot that we could do, and why are we neglecting so much of it? And then we wonder why people don't seem to understand what it is that is distinguishing about our tradition. It's really, I mean, I would argue classical Anglicanism is the fullest expression of the lex orandi, lex credendi principle. When it's done properly, there is no way you cannot live a life based around the rule the prayer book gives and not have a robust understanding and experience of prayer. I mean, St. Paul's idea of pray without ceasing, that's the point of the prayer book life. Mm-hmm. That's the point of it. And for some reason, we have been afraid to really bring that to our people, as if, well, they don't really bother to come. They won't come if it's a matins. We have to start doing the work as clergy to restore the prayer book as a rule that can be shared amongst all people. If we want to debate the specifics of, what morning evening prayer should look like, fine. I mean, I produced this Anglican office book and felt very strongly that morning and evening prayer in the prayer book are fine, but they're also missing an awful lot of the tradition. So instead of abandoning the tradition, let's restore the fullness back to it. I think Anglo-Catholics have a gift at being able to do this when we're not so worried about trying to ape something else, which is one of our biggest flaws.
Which it's understanding and appreciating and promoting our own tradition.
That's right.
You're right. That is something that has happened constantly. Are we Protestant? Are we Anglo-Evangelical? Or are we Anglo-Catholics? If we're Catholics, why aren't we using fiddleback chalices and lace? If we're Protestants, why are we using? And you're like, wait a minute, no. We're not Protestants, other than the fact that we curbed some of the excesses of Rome, and we brought the church back to its ancient foundation. And we are not Catholics in the sense of, we are Catholics in the sense of following the universal church and not falling into any one camp. We're Anglicans. We don't need to be Anglican Catholics or Anglican Protestants. The Anglican Church is a church that is sought its roots in the, as you say, Northern Catholicism. This idea that the church's job is to be a church of its community, to pray, and to nourish the souls under its care in a complete fashion. So, public the Eucharist, public prayer, and then private devotions. And the more I hear this, are you an Anglo Catholic? Are you evangelical? The Church of England is Protestant. I say, well, you know, it has a history, and all those names have been bounced around it. But I like the idea of saying I'm an Anglican, and it is a church which is founded in monastic spirituality and apostolic succession, and it is a sacramental and a liturgical church, and that's really all you need to know.
That's right. And I think one of the temperaments that is part and parcel with Anglicanism, and by the way, is exactly why the Canterbury Communion is now failing, is a reliance on tradition. So one thing that I find somewhat ironic with certain of your higher, as it were, Anglo-Catholics is, for example, a real love of sort of the Roman approach to worship and the devotional life, say, circa 1950. Okay. And something wrong with that in theory. But one of the examples I like to use is, okay, well, let's take the breviary. For example, the Anglican breviary was an attempt to take the Roman breviary of that time and sort of cloak it with the Anglican language and conform it to the prayer book and things like this. And that's perfectly fine. I'm a huge fan of the breviary. But we all have to admit that when we look to 1950s Catholicism, particularly with the daily office as a benchmark, well, the Psalter of the Roman Breviary in 1950 had only been in use for 40 years. It was invented in 1911, almost out of whole cloth. And yet the 30-day Psalter of the Book of Common Prayer has a 500-year history behind it now. A full quarter of the church's existence has seen an organic tradition now derived from the prayer book. And so when people say we want to abandon the prayer book tradition or it's not useful, and let's look instead to mid-20th century Roman Catholicism, it's a little nonsensical to me, because so much of what was going on in the 1950s Roman Church was itself a state of flux, a state of embracing new ideas about how to do things. And yet here we are with this tradition that goes back in the prayer book forms 500 years, and in certain ways much further than that. So I'm not terribly sympathetic to this idea that we need to look elsewhere to find our rule of life. I'm not sure why certain circles have such an antipathy towards the prayer book. I can understand the desire to expand it, to clarify it, and we must. If there's confusion about the Catholic faith by something in the prayer book, then we must clarify that, like the articles, for example. But if we abandon it as a rule of prayer, then where do we leave our people? Then where do they look? Well, we know where they're going to look. They're going to look to any number of popular religious concepts around them. If our people don't,
elsewhere. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
If we don't stand behind and reinforce and pray and preach the prayer book tradition of this rule of life based on centuries and centuries of the church praying, of this monastic philosophy, lectio, meditatio, contemplatio, using the scriptures as the monks did, and having this be something that any Christian can enter into. We don't, as you say, practice and preach this, they're going to look elsewhere. And which is really unfortunate, a great shame in my opinion, because I think it's a real treasure of Christian piety that is the best of centuries of Christian practice was put together for this people in England, and primarily, I think, largely because of the desire to pray in the vernacular, the desire to be engaged and involved, led to this movement. And Cranmer began and others continued on after him, but it has created I think a heavenly genius of structure of life in prayer, Christian life.
That's right. And the way forward, it seems to me, is, especially as the culture becomes increasingly hostile, the way forward is we must recover a strong sense of what prayer is in the Christian life. And we already have an excellent tool to get our people going in that direction. We need to embrace that tool and use it. We don't need to dumb it down. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. I mean, my goodness, the very fact that Rome and the East and countless variations of Protestantism have cannibalized the prayer book to certain extents should tell us of the spiritual staying power of these texts, of this system. I mean, there is scarcely a Christian tradition, that has not in some way or another come into contact with the prayer book, whether it be, Eastern Orthodox coming over here 100 years ago and translating their liturgy using the language of the prayer book and of the King James, which many of them did, whether it's, the Presbyterian Book of Order having phrases taken out of the prayer book, the Methodists, the Pentecostals using the King James. I mean, let's face it, English Christianity is Anglicanism. And our goal needs to be to bring all of our fellow English-speaking Christians back into the fold. The prayer book is the way to do that.
Amen.
Well, Father, anything else you'd like to discuss?
No, I think that was a good discussion. I think that's that's the perfect way to end it.
Very good.
All right. Thank you very much. Until next time.